Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, coolers, shield legislators, peasants, vassals. Did I forget anyone? I'm a useful idiot, and today I'm going to get a little more abstract than I usually do. Generally, I try to present interesting new historical events and of course, economic fraud and all the other hot topics of the day, presented in a simple format so everybody can glean the basic ideas. But today I'm going to get a little more abstract and talk about an idea and a theory about fragmentation in geopolitical history. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but the basic idea is that, of course, nation-states change all the time. Empires come and go throughout history. And we have these border changes. And there's a interesting trajectory through history, and we've seen a huge paradigm shift in the post-globalization world. Of course, we're not quite in the post-globalization world, but in the midst of globalization, the idea of fragmentation is taking on all new meaning. And anyway, let me begin discussing this whole idea. And of course, throughout history, in the pre-globalization age, we have empires come and go. And of course, empires have to come and go because the parts create too much internal pressure, and eventually they have to disperse again. And empires are very hard to hold together. And with each new technological advance and each new epoch in history, of course, we've had a new challenger. We go back to of course, Alexander the Great conquering much of the known world at that time, and the Roman Empire being an exemplary example. And of course, the Roman Empire is a perfect example of an empire that has to basically fragment, be involved in this fragmentation process in order to return back to its smaller components again, necessarily. Because Rome found itself stretched too thin and bankrupt, and all sorts of decay from within, and all the natural things we see in the creation of the state. And so historically we have a number of examples of this, and I say it's a historical imperative that all of these artificially created configurations and empires and states have to break down into smaller components. And these smaller components will break down into even smaller components because we're also in a post-colonial world. And so a lot of colonial borders need to be redressed, and ethnic regions that have been divided by colonial borders, like, for example, in Kurdistan, which borders in nations all around that area, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Turkey, all share a Kurdish population just because of a colonial border, and therefore those tensions will exist. And this is a pattern we see all over the world, of course, in Bosnia and places in Asia, where these colonial borders continue to give us headaches to this day. And a lot of that is because of a post-colonial era, and now we have these tensions coming to the fore in this era of globalization. So once again, historically, we have, of course, a lot of empires and configurations were broken down after World War I in the early part of the 20th century. So the world that went into World War I in 1914 came out a considerably different world in 1917, with all the monarchies being replaced by rising fascist states and corporate government partnerships, and in that war, of course, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire disintegrated after quite a number of hundred years of existence. So we ended up with Austria and Hungary and a whole number of countries down in the Balkan area. And then we had the Ottoman Empire too, the Turkish Empire that covered most of the Middle East as we know it today. And that also disintegrated in the post-World War I world. And then, of course, Yugoslavia came out of Austro-Hungarian Empire, And in the post-Cold War era, Yugoslavia had to break down back into its smaller components. So we see this fragmentation again. So then we end up with Serbia and Bosnia and Montenegro and all of that area. And of course, the most notable example in our time is the Soviet Union. So once again, here's an area made up of various ethnic regions artificially constructed into a vast empire, one state that had to resort back to its, or return back to its fragmentation and become all smaller components again. And of course, we're going to see borders redressed even in former Soviet states, like what we see in the breakaway areas in the Ossetia areas in Georgia. So we're going to see further fragmentation in ethnic regions in the former Soviet republics, because this fragmentation process will continue. And the other part of this fragmentation process that interests me is the fact that now fragmentation is going to be part of the construction of the New World Order, because it will be divide and conquer. So a lot of people think that the New World Order would be to basically construct one giant state, but in reality the first step will be to break down more countries into smaller components, divide and conquer. And that will be these feudalistic financial districts that these new states will become. And so there will be more fragmentation. And of course we're seeing that in our time. There's pressures going on right now where Scotland might become independent from the United Kingdom, and Venice is talking about being independent from Italy. And of course we have Catalonia in Spain that is talking about becoming an independent country. And there's lots of talk of Kurdistan redressing its problems and being carved out of Syria. And now we're also seeing another interesting step in fragmentation, and that is being wielded as a foreign policy. And that's where we see that U.S. foreign policy will be about dividing northern Sudan into southern Sudan. We're probably going to end up splitting Libya into two or more regions. There's talk about splitting Syria up into multiple regions. And so it's being fragmentation, and that's the theme of this video, is also being used as a state policy and a foreign policy. And I'm going to take this idea one step further, because in this overview, especially historically, we see borders change around the world all the time. It looks like a very organic process when you see a time lapse of the empires ebb and flow, and countries come and go and disappear, enlarge. For example, Poland's borders have changed at the end of every war, stretching back over centuries. So even just Poland's borders have changed significantly. So anyway, and to take this idea of fragmentation even further, I suggest, since it's become state policy to destabilize a country like Syria and put it through a fragmentation process, where all these world tribal, ethnic, provincial rivalries will all have to be sorted out in the post-colonial era. Now that we are in globalization, that will be the theme for the next few decades, I would suggest. And to take it to the ultimate test, I would suggest that U.S. foreign policy will eventually be to isolate Russia and China and create the same fragmentation process and destabilization, so that Russia and the other republics in that area break down into even smaller components, and which are more manageable, and that way out war can be circumvented with its new battlefield of economics and this subversive fragmentation, destabilization process. And I would suggest that the same process will be applied to China. seems to me that it wouldn't be that hard a process. If China is completely isolated, and even if China and Russia are completely isolated, it would be easy to undermine, destabilize China by putting economic pressures on them. They have a lot of civil unrest there, potential civil unrest anyway, and they have a large population to take care of. So there's a lot of issues there. So it would be very easy to put this fragmentation process onto China as well, split off Tibet and Mongolia and different provinces, and you'd see the whole thing unravel. But anyway, so there's my theory about fragmentation in geopolitical history, and how it's being used today and how it applies today. And I think it has a lot to do with everything. So, food for thought. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.